Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak tonight. My name's Tom Ballantine. I'm Chair of Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, and I've been asked to speak about the climate talks in Paris and Scotland's response and what you can do about this particular issue. I want to start by saying thank you to Spokes for the fantastic work you do on promoting cycling in my city. I am a very keen cyclist, and I really value and appreciate the work you do on my behalf. I'm a member, and you are also members of my coalition, so thank you for that. I also want to mention that On Your Bike to Paris cycling trip, which has been organised by your organisation, leaving on the 28th of November, I believe, going all the way to Paris to let your views be heard on the issue of climate change at the talks in Paris. I'm going to have to say I've got 15 minutes to cover a very complicated issue, so I am really going to have to go for headlines. I'm going to have to be quick, and it's a whistle-stop tour. I appreciate that people here, many of the people here will already know some of the stuff I'm going to say, but I don't suppose it does us any harm just to be reminded of some of the facts. So, what are the facts? First of all, Stop Climate Chaos Scotland. If you haven't heard of it, we're an organisation that really covers the whole of Scottish society. We've got church groups, environment groups, development groups, Oxfam Christian Aid, Unison, the union, students, you name it, we've got groups of people from across Scottish society who are members of our coalition. So we've all come together to talk about climate change, and of course a key moment on our horizon is the Paris talks. And here's my quick sketch. We've been talking about climate change since the 19th century, but in 1992, a key step was taken with the setting up of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, effectively a treaty arrangement to try and ensure that the world reduced its emissions. In 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC, was set up, and what people, I think, in this room will probably know already is that they don't do their own original research, they don't monitor climate or related phenomena, and they base their assessments of what's happening on published literature. We've had 5 assessment reports, and the latest report came in 2014, and the news there was really just a clearer version of what had been said many times before. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, it is extremely likely, and that means by their definition is 95 to 100% certain that humans are having an influence and have been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century on the climate. Each of the last 3 decades have been successively warmer at the Earth's surface than the preceding decades since 1850. What we know from that report is that to keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees, we need to do lots of things. And there's quite a lot of debate about whether 2 degrees is enough or whether it actually needs to be 1.5 degrees, but I haven't got time to go into that. And essentially, the report says the more we do now, the lower the temperature increase, the lower the impact. The less we do now, the higher the temperature, the more severe the impacts, and the greater the likelihood of irreversible and unanticipated change. There's mention of the tipping point, the idea that at a certain point the changes we make to our planet produced by the warming would produce more warming, leading to more negative changes, taking us on a downward spiral from which we could not come back. Why does this all matter? Well, we're already seeing impacts around the world from climate change. I speak regularly to organisations like Christian Aid, Oxfam. I ask them how much of their work do they think is already related to the effects of climate change. Someone in Christian Aid, the director of Christian Aid, in fact, said she thought it was about 50% of their work is already about adaptation, about getting ready for climate change. What we can expect to see more of is extreme weather events, coastal flooding and displaced people due to land loss, reducing yields of major crops, extinction risk for animal species, large urban populations put at risk of severe harm through rising seas or whatever else it might be, human insecurity with increased risks of violent conflicts due to amplified poverty and economic shocks. I always try and think of some sort of light way of putting all of this, but really there is no light way of putting this. This is a serious, serious situation, and it's clearly one that we need to do our best to avoid. The IPCC 5th Assessment Report particularly talks about this idea of the tipping point. The precise levels of climate change sufficient to trigger a tipping point, a threshold for abrupt and irreversible change, remain uncertain. The risks associated with crossing multiple tipping points increase with rising temperature. And as I say, Once you've done it, once you've spilt it, you don't get it back. We also know that there are vast amounts of fossil fuel left in the earth that we can't afford to burn. I look at statistics quite often and they all seem to vary, so I've just plucked one. Suffice it to say that the general view seems to be that we can afford to burn perhaps 20 to 25% of our remaining fossil fuel reserves, so not that much. Big challenge, how is Scotland responding? Well, we have the Climate Change Act passed unanimously in our Parliament in 2009. We have our targets, a percentage target of 42% reduction on 1990 levels of emissions by 2020, and an 80% reduction on our emissions by 2050. And then going on to the year 2020, we have annual targets measured in tonnages. So we have to reduce our emissions by fixed amounts each year. Are we hitting our targets? Well, we look like we're doing a good job on getting towards our 2020 target. We have had a 34% reduction on emissions from 1990 levels without adjustment for European emissions trading schemes. Now, I haven't got long enough, I think, today to go into the difference between adjusted and unadjusted emissions, but suffice it to say that if you take into account the European emissions trading scheme, then you stand at a figure of 38%. Reduction since 1990. I prefer to look at the figure without the emissions trading scheme, and that's 34%, but still a substantial way towards that 2020 target. Strangely, we're missing our annual targets, and that's really quite simple as to why we're missing annual targets, and yet we're on the way to our 2020 targets. The annual targets are a fixed tonnage that we have to meet each year. They were fixed back in 2009 when the Act came into force, and it transpires that we started the figures at the wrong level in 1990, and it's actually more difficult to go from the higher figure that existed in 1990 to the annual figures. If you're looking at 2020, the percentage of a higher figure is actually easier to hit. So if you took 100% and you took 42% of 100%, that would be 42. If you took 100% of 200, that would be 84. You can see why it's easier to hit a percentage than it is to hit a fixed tonnage. The bottom line is a lot more needs to be done. Alison has mentioned transport, but it's really across all sectors of our society in Scotland, a lot more needs to be done. And particularly there are big infrastructure decisions made. We've mentioned roads, big decisions being made every day, which don't just affect the picture up to 2020, they affect the picture up to 2050 as well. I've put the bath there because what we have is an absolute amount of emissions that we can put out into the atmosphere. So every year that we fill that bath and put more in than we wanted to, we're just making it more difficult in subsequent years to stop the bath overflowing. That is why the annual tonnages matter, not just 2020. Thrown this one in because, again, there's lots of argument about what our emissions are per capita, and the people in here will say those are too low or too high, but the general picture is a true one, which is that people in the developed world, Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, have much higher carbon footprints per capita than people in the developing world, such as Uganda, India, Brazil. And we need to remember that when we're talking about what we're going to do for the future. How is Scotland responding abroad? Well, what we're saying is, follow our example. We've set high targets. We are creating a prosperous, low-carbon future. We think it's possible to create that future. Follow our example. Critically, as Alison said, there's no point in saying follow our example if actually we're not going to deliver on our annual targets. So it's a difficult situation we're in Scotland. I think we have to admire the target, but a target is meaningless if you don't hit it. We talk about climate justice, and again, many of you will know that in 2012, with cross-party support, a climate justice fund was set up in Scotland. So the idea that the developing world, the poorest people in the world, are paying the highest price for climate change, that needs to be addressed. And one of the ways of addressing it is to provide funding for adaptation to help those people in those nations to adapt to the situation. We're the ones who caused it, they're the ones paying the price, and we need to do something to be fairer about that. Very quickly, the question arises, what can I do as an individual? I think many of you will be familiar with these things. consume less. Consumption in the developed world is massive and has risen astronomically over the last decades, and consumption is at the heart of much of this. It's about using carbon to create things that we don't necessarily need or use. Be more energy efficient in the home, drive and fly less, more walking and more cycling. Cycling definitely gets in there. Flying is an absolutely disastrous aspect of behaviour when you look at the emissions and the projected emissions from flying for the future. One of the political points that may come up in the discussion later on is about air passenger duty and the current government's intention to halve air passenger duty in Scotland. Well, if you halve taxes on flying, what are you going to do? You're going to push more people into flying rather than using low carbon alternatives like the train. It's back to the idea of what is fair. What do you value? And clearly, if you value people using their bike, if you value people using the train, then you have to put your money there, not into allowing people to fly more. Eat local seasonal food, and of course critically support government and policies at home and abroad that will make change happen. I've got to put my plug in now for the rally on the 28th of November in Edinburgh, Scotland's Climate March, 12 noon at the Meadows. I really think it is very important that we have the biggest possible number there, because numbers do matter on this occasion. They're saying, both to the Scottish Government and internationally, that we all care about this issue and that we want them to do something about it. And there are going to be marches going on throughout the world on the 28th of November. Running along in the background for Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, we've had the For the Love Of campaign over the last year. It's a good illustration of the kind of work we're trying to do to get behaviour changed. And I guess it's really been about asking people throughout the UK, in fact, with our sister organisation, the Climate Coalition, what is it that they care about that is affected by climate change? And of course the answer is most things that we care about are affected by climate change. Our children, our crops, our landscapes, our cities. Everything that you can pretty much think about is going to be affected or is already affected by what's going on. Politically, we have an agreement going towards the 2016 election from the parties you see listed there. We commit to making each of our party manifestos for the 2016 Holyrood election consistent with delivering the ambitions of Scotland's Climate Change Act. Well, and to be fair, in that agreement, the parties go on to list good attitudes to electricity generation, transport, energy efficiency, food sector, the climate justice fund that I mentioned. All of these intentions sound great, but it only matters if you get delivery. Our manifesto for 2016, so basically as an organisation, we've said what we think government needs to prioritise going forward. I won't go through all of them, but you will see that at number 4 is a meaningful shift from private car to public transport and active travel. And at number 5 is this idea that if you're going to cut air passenger duty, then use an alternative to cut climate emissions. I wait with not with bated breath to see what happens there, but it's a clear example of somewhere where government has to put its money where its mouth is. Back to the big picture on this whistle-stop tour. Is Paris the last chance? Well, the UN process is not perfect, but it's an important moment, a key step on the way to sorting out this issue. When I talk about this issue quite a lot in public venues, and I always say that I believe there is momentum. I believe there is a momentum throughout the world to do something about this issue. If you look at China, if you look at America, if you look at India, big nations that are making steps in the right direction. So there is momentum, and this time in Paris is going to be a key moment, seeing how well that momentum is maintained. We need agreement to binding ambitious targets. We need a demand for a plan to follow up on those targets, and critically, the word I've mentioned a few times, we need action, delivery and action. Because the critical question is not, will things change? I am absolutely convinced things will change and are changing. The big question is, will they change fast enough to avoid the worst outcomes of climate change? We're not going to avoid, we're already seeing the beginnings of climate change. The issue is, can we avoid the most critical outcomes from climate change? Where are we now for Paris? Just the kind of discussions that we've seen all through the United Nations negotiations going right back, the developed versus developing nations, so developed nations saying we want to do less, and the developing nations saying you need to do more. The idea has always been that if you're a developed nation, you should be reducing your emissions, but that you accept that developing nations want the same levels of prosperity we have, so they are bound to have increased emissions going for a certain amount of time, so you allow the emissions from the developing world to converge with the developing world. You converge and then you contract. The fault lines are going to be about levels of commitment. How far are people going to go at these talks? Will they do enough? And are they going to give enough money towards adaptation for the poorer nations around the world who are already suffering and will suffer more than us from the effects of climate change? Will it be binding? Will it be non-binding? In advance of Paris, so last year in Lima there were discussions about what was going to happen in Paris, and nations were asked to provide voluntarily their intended nationally determined contributions, their INDCs. We have most of them in by now, and as I say there, it's about, we're heading towards 2.7 degrees, or many people would argue it's higher than that. So at one level that's extremely gloomy, because it's not enough, but at another level it's a lot further than we were even a year ago, so that's momentum. What we have to bear in mind is that if we're not ambitious enough now, then it may be significantly more difficult to catch up later. So there's a lot of talk about what will happen after Paris if it turns out that we've not done enough. And the answer is, well, we'll have to do more, but it will be much more difficult to do more. We have a draft text going into Paris with 1,490 brackets. So those are the spaces that are going to be filled in 2 weeks. It's going to be an interesting 2 weeks. What can we hope for? Just the things I mentioned before. A binding agreement, funding for adaptation, a proper review process, and stronger commitments. Just the things I've mentioned, but particularly I think the review process is going to be important, and the fact that it has to be binding. Of course, it could all fall apart. That's the other possibility. Who is this issue about? I get told, or people say to me, well, why aren't environmentalists doing more about this issue? Well, the answer is it's not an issue for environmentalists, it's an issue for everyone now. On the 28th of November, I've told you about our march. I hope, because this affects you, this affects your family, affects everyone, I hope you will be there to support us. 12th of December, I mentioned on the previous slide, Paris. Events in Paris over the last few days have put the intended march in Paris into doubt. I don't know what's going to happen there. I was being asked this beforehand. I really don't know where that's going to go. I think it's just a case of wait and see. There is an alternative, positive future if we act now, and that's, I suppose, the frustrating thing for people like me involved in campaigning on this. It's a bit like Alison said. We have multiple benefits if we act. We're for health, happiness, and prosperity. We have fairness for the world's poorest people who deserve it. We have a viable planet for future generations and our children. They deserve it. Cycling, to come back to what this organisation is all about, is one of those emblematic things for me. It's up to people getting out there, getting out of their cars, using their own feet, getting on that bike and cycling around. Thank you for what you do on this issue. I really hope that you will continue with your cycling, and that government and everyone else will support you in doing more cycling, and that we will see this issue addressed over the coming weeks, months, years. Thank you.